Hello and welcome to County Board Wrap-Up, our look at the key actions the County Board takes at its monthly meeting. I'm your host, Kara O'Donnell, and today I'm going to be talking with Board Chair Christian Dorsey and Board Member Katie Crystal about the decisions made at their July meeting that impact you, your family, and our community. Katie, Christian, thank you both for being here. We're going to start off today with Vision Zero, which sounds very, futuristic, but what is Vision Zero?
Well, it's not futuristic, but it is European. At least that's where it started. It's something that began in Sweden, but it's an international approach to traffic management and safety in 40 localities across the United States, including our neighbors, Alexandria, Montgomery County, and the district, have become a part of the Vision Zero community and adopted the framework that says traffic deaths and severe injuries are in fact preventable. And that should be the guiding sort of light behind traffic management. And it's different than the way in which we've traditionally done things in this country, where we essentially accept that there are bad things that are going to happen and we kind of engineer our networks to do the best they can. Vision Zero sort of takes it to the next level and says, if you incorporate not only systems design, but recognize human failures and involve people in being educated about how to use our various road networks, we can actually reduce the incidences of severe injury and death.
Okay, so how does this program work? It sounds very good in theory, but how does it actually become implemented?
So, good news, in Arlington, we've done a lot of good things that are very much in the Vision Zero approach, where we have our various modes that people use our roads, whether it be active transportation, cars, transit, and we very much tried to figure out how to safely accommodate all of those users. And as a result, even though our population has grown, the number of severe injuries and death have decreased over the last 5 years. So we think that we're very much in the spirit of Vision Zero, but what we hope to gain from it are the best practices from those 40 communities in the country and many more around the world, where we can figure out how to do even better. Because quite frankly, we should get to the point where any severe injury or death on our public roadways are too many. And that's where we can always do better, and we should do better.
And one of the actions that we took was not just adopting this resolution and the board policy level commitment to it, but we tasked the manager, the county manager and staff to come up with an implementation plan, which they'll be working on over the next 12 to 18 months with a draft completion date in fall of 2020. The goal is, of course, to engage our citizens, but also to engage interdepartmentally. There was a lot of community push to adopt Vision Zero, for example, as part of the bike element update of the master transportation plan. And one of the things that we heard loud and clear from our experts and a number of well-informed citizen stakeholders was that if you make it a bike priority, then that really limits all of the interdepartmental folks and all of the different types of stakeholders that need to be involved in the conversation. So that is the conversation we've asked the manager and staff to have, as well as looking at, as Mr. Dorsey was suggesting, those international and national best practices. So we're looking forward to seeing the more specific plan and the steps to get us to the goal of zero traffic fatalities and deaths.
So it's pretty much just kind of a best practices sharing at a global level with communities that have bought into this particular strategy. What can our residents expect from this kind of thing? Will there be changes in traffic laws? Will there be, different signal operations? What can they expect at the literal street level?
Well, that's excellent, and we don't exactly know. We suspect that it's going to be a lot of what we do now, but maybe refined and under a better, more comprehensive focus. So I think we have some of the best roadway design and engineering folks who work in local government anywhere around. I think they do a tremendous job accommodating all of our various users, but there's still probably work that they can do. The biggest piece that I at least see coming from this is a public awareness approach to this. When we typically hear from people about traffic issues, it's about a spot issue. Here's a problematic intersection, or here's an area where I don't feel safe. Can you fix that area? Part of, I think, what Vision Zero is going to do is to figure out how we can better engineer those, design those roadways, but also how we can better educate people as to the hazards and the concerns, and to see that there's different behavior from them. So that's where I think the true promise is going to come from not just assigning the priority to the people who design the roadway, but to all of us who use it.
That's absolutely right. And to give specific examples, one of the principles that I know we've adopted to some extent, and I think Vision Zero will help speed along, Kara, when you were asking about how will things look differently at the street level, is historically in this country specifically, there's been a real emphasis on getting as many cars through intersections and roadways as fast as possible, as many as possible. And I think what Vision Zero and good safety-oriented multimodal planning really does is say, how do we make sure everyone, no matter their mode, can get through this, for example, intersection as safely as possible. And one of the things I love about Vision Zero is that it doesn't assume perfect driver or human behavior. It recognizes that there are going to be people who are distracted on their cell phones, tending to a passenger or talking to a passenger. And so how do you create, again, to use that example of the intersection that has the visual cues or the physical cues that slow that vehicle down, so that if there is an interaction, an unexpected interaction, a distracted driver, the speeds are slow enough, the visual cues are enough that those brakes can be tapped fast enough to avoid a collision.
Because here in Arlington especially, we have so many different forms of transportation.
Yeah.
You have people taking public transit, you have people in their own cars, you have bikes, scooters, walking, you name it. So there's a lot of
Uber and Lyft and delivery drivers who aren't familiar with
a lot of
Arlington.
moving parts.
Which is a huge element of this. You know, when you talk about human behavior and failing behavior, even though it's not legal for people to double park and to park in curb lanes, we can't pretend that it doesn't exist.
Yeah. Right.
So we have to factor all of that into what we do.
So you mentioned, Kitty, the manager's going to be working on this with staff for the next year plus or so?
Our goal is to have a draft plan to complete it in fall of 2020. But I think people can expect some initial public engagement as soon as this fall.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, it'll be really interesting to see what that study comes up with. So we'll stay tuned on that one. Moving now to the board decision on child care center parking. This is something we've talked about a lot in different aspects of a child care initiative here in Arlington, but what specifically was decided at this meeting?
So I would say the important umbrella, or what all of these code changes we've adopted on childcare have in common, is that we are trying to increase the supply of quality childcare by knocking down some of those barriers that are not core to that mission of providing quality environments for our youngest Arlingtonians. And parking is a great example of that. So this has been an ongoing effort, and I'm sure it's been discussed in County Board Wrap-Up before, even the area of parking. How do you reduce the number of parking spaces so that we have, to use a sort of buzzwordy term, right-size the parking? We're not requiring those child care centers to provide more parking than they really need. And that's important because parking is expensive. It can limit the number of places that a child care center can open, or in some cases, we have required child care centers to rent off-site parking. And if you are a really low-margin business, which childcare is, having that additional demand on your balance sheet can really make or break your future or your ability to take on more kids. So this was kind of an additional add-on step when we acted back in April, I think it was. Or excuse me, it might have actually been our March meeting to adopt a bunch of zoning ordinance reforms as well as childcare ordinance reforms to pursue that goal that I was describing. Our Planning Commission, actually, and our Transportation Commission gave us the recommendation, can you push this a little further? Are we being overly cautious about how much parking we're requiring? And again, recognizing the expense and opportunity cost of that parking, it seemed worth it to really home in and make sure that we were looking at this as efficaciously as we could. So our staff, who have been indefatigable on this, took a new look at or fresher look at the childcare ratios and proposed that they could responsibly advocate to further reduce from 1 space per 8 kids to 1 space per 10 kids, consistent with the new ratios of staff required for the kids. And we actually had a very real-life example. An item pulled from our consent agenda that we also heard on Tuesday night was a child care center saying, it's a little bit of a mismatch. I'm coming in at 1 in 8, but I actually have the staffing ratio that's closer to 1 in 10. Okay. It would be really helpful for me if it was closer to 1 in 10. So it's sort of nice to be able to say, stay tuned. We're taking that action an hour later.
So this gives the child care centers, in the long run, a little more opportunity to either allow more children or?
Well, it's a lot more opportunity. You know, we talk about the ratios 1 in 8, 1 in 10, but that's a 25% reduction in their parking requirement. And you know, as Katie said, hopefully this will allow for further resources to be invested in either quality childcare or reducing the cost of childcare. That's really what we're ultimately trying to do, while at the same time balancing making sure we're not putting a parking burden, if you will, elsewhere. So that's the sort of policy magic that we were trying to thread, and staff did a great job of recognizing that, you know, these ratios, which were in a zoning ordinance, were from another time and with other circumstances that guided their implementation. So they did updated studies. They looked at what's the behavior now of childcare centers and their parking needs and how many employees use modes other than driving alone to get to work. And we found that there was absolutely room where we could decrease that responsibility, which has real costs.
Yeah. Now, there was also a related action involving the use permits for family daycare homes, and I think there was a little back and forth that went happen there. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
We have been chatting with our staff about making sure we can communicate exactly what was done, and that it's actually about creating opportunity and reducing barriers for childcare centers. I actually have a neighbor who's been operating a childcare center out of her home for, I want to say, close to 3 decades now. And we got that letter, that as did a number of neighbors living near in-home daycare providers, that looked like 61 providers were being shuttered, which was deeply concerning to a lot of folks. So we were glad to have this opportunity and from the dais to clarify what that action actually does is the opposite. It's going to make them easier to get the permission, so to speak, that they need to continue operating. Our in-home daycare providers used to have to come to the county board for approval. Most of the time they ended up on the consent agenda, no problem, but what we heard from a lot of our providers is it introduces uncertainty. You might be ready to go, and then you're waiting for the next board meeting, and you don't know if that item is going to be pulled. You don't know if it's moving forward. And this is for providers who have the full sign-off from our staff, from our Office of Childcare Licensing, from Planning and Zoning, that this use is compatible with their neighborhood, that they're operating a quality environment, and they were waiting for that extra procedural step. So what this decision or this action that we took did essentially was say, you now have an administrative path. If you are consistent with the planning and zoning use for your neighborhood, and the Office of Childcare Licensing says you're providing a clean and safe and quality environment, by all means go forward. You don't need to take the extra step of coming before the county's policy-making body to get formal approval. So we are seeking to clarify that to any concerned neighbors. This is actually about helping those 61 providers gain more predictability and ease for continuing to operate.
And equity. I mean, you can operate any of a number of home businesses without the county government, the board level, getting involved. And why in the world should childcare be any different? Let's let the professionals in the Childcare Licensing Office determine whether or not you're suitable and fit. And let's not politicize something that, one, puts you at a different level than other home-based businesses. And, we're talking about providing care for children. And, it was just something that was unreconcilable, at least for us.
And just while we're on the topic, what are the next steps for the child care initiative? Because there's many different levels of the many different factions of it.
Yeah, we got some long-term
we do.
actions coming in,
We were
right?
just meeting as the Child Care Initiative Leadership Roundtable a couple weeks ago to talk about exactly that. One of the big things, of course, is monitoring how all of these implemented policy changes are working, whether they're working as achieved. One of the biggest things that we're focused on, have been focused on since the start, and will continue to focus on, is really that equity piece for our lowest income families and for our children with special needs, whether they may be developmental delays or something else. What does their access look like? That's been the area of greatest concern, and so we're looking at, for example, is there an opportunity to expand or to better market the subsidies? One of our biggest challenges is that we do have subsidies to support families. A lot of child care providers don't take them. They sort of, generally the most common answer we get is that we've got wait lists out the wazoo already. So to participate in that extra step for subsidies isn't necessary. So can we make the regulatory burden for subsidy participation on the part of the provider lower? Or is it there a path to just create more spots so that the opportunity, the demand is meeting, or the supply is meeting demand better? One of the other things we've been talking about too, and this really is interrelated with equity, is childcare during non-traditional times. Our model is very much based around that kind of 9 to 5, supporting parents who have traditional professional jobs. We know a lot of folks in our community are working shifts, or sometimes need drop-in childcare so they can further their education or go on a job interview. And so that's a big area of study for us next too.
Okay, we will also stay tuned on that one. We're going to take a short break now. When we come back, we're going to be talking about new transit stations along Columbia Pike, as well as the decision to close the 23rd Street pedestrian tunnel in Crystal City. Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm here with County Board Chair Christian Dorsey and Board Member Katie Crystal, who are going to tell me when we can expect to see new transit stations along Columbia Pike. Now, this generated quite a bit of discussion, the transit stations, and the Pike's transit as a whole has been a topic of discussion for quite some time. So tell me a little about these new transit stations.
All right, you want to start us off, Katie?
I would be happy to. So we were very glad to finally be in the position of awarding a contract. These stations are expected to be operating by fall 2020. It is behind. This project is behind for a variety of reasons. Some are the stations have been reworked to bring down the cost. And a lot of it has to do with coordination with our partners at WMATA on bus service and beyond. The reality is that Columbia Pike is the busiest bus corridor in the Commonwealth of Virginia. It needs more than what folks think of as, somebody characterized it to me recently as a simple bus station with maybe a roof and a bench, right? This is a station that actually serves thousands of riders every day at peak times. And so what we're trying to build here is something that's probably a little more akin to what you might picture with a metro station platform, rather than that kind of traditional simple bench. So it's been a very involved project, and it's a really critical one. The ultimate goal here is to move as many bus riders as quickly as possible down Columbia Pike. And so these transit stations are designed to do exactly that.
And if I could just make sure that we're very clear about this, because as you mentioned, Kara, this has been the subject for many years, and a lot of it has been misinterpreted. The actual transit stations, the things that you see above ground, those are being delivered, and those come in different configurations, single-sized up to quadruple size, depending on the needs of the riders at that particular stop. But on average, the above ground portion, the actual bus stop, the transit station, those cost $150,000 on average for all of those configurations. What we're doing with these is a substantial amount of infrastructure, including undergrounding some conduit to provide technical capacity, and also raising and leveling curbs so that they can provide level boarding with the actual buses. That's where the real cost is coming from.
That's where that cost comes in.
So,
about 2/3, right?
Yeah. So, as many people have been conditioned over the years to think that Arlington is pursuing these really extravagant, expensive
Shelters.
bus shelters, that's not the case at all. Those are very much in line with what you'd see anywhere else. It is the substantial amount of infrastructure that we're doing that is causing the kind of costs that make these about $400,000 per stop. But only a third of that is the actual
structure
thing.
in and of itself.
Yeah.
Okay. So will these replace traditional bus stations as we have known them in the past, or are these additional stops?
So these are going to replace existing bus stations, and we've seen a vision of this in Crystal City, for example, where there are a number of these types of stations already installed and in place as part of the Crystal City Potomac Yard Transit Way. So this is very similar. It's going to have its own look for Columbia Pike, but it's very similar to that concept. So we're bringing it to an area that, as Katie said, has, by virtue of demand, long needed it.
And I think what's interesting, so I'm a Pike bus rider, right? And I live not too far from the intersection where one of these stops is coming. And I think for our riders of this frequent service on the Columbia Pike, you can envision how transformative it would be to have some of those infrastructure elements Christian's talking about. If you've ever waited because your bus is the third one in line and you're waiting for each bus to load its passengers, you hear that big hydraulic sound as it lowers closer to the ground to accommodate somebody with a stroller or mobility device. You can imagine having that physical in-ground infrastructure that allows multiple buses to board at the same time. Doesn't require the buses to raise and lower. That really starts to add up those number of minutes. And so you can imagine at scale, as those buses are trying to go down the Pike more quickly and more effectively, a couple of minutes at each stop adds up to buses that are reliably on time and get you to your destination faster. And we know that is exactly the measure by which people, whether they can kind of fully articulate it or not, decide whether to choose to ride the bus versus to drive.
Taking a car. Yeah. Art, now how do these stations fit into the broader Columbia Pike transit scene as it is?
Well, there is, I think a lot of people in our community expect that we're going to turn one dial and magically one new thing is going to appear, and it doesn't work that way. And already we've started delivering what we're calling the premium transit network on Columbia Pike, which first began with consolidating the 11 different bus routes that go along Columbia Pike operated by Metro, WMATA. We consolidated those into about 5 so that it's much more user-friendly, that you understand where these buses are going to go and you don't have to remember the 16A, C, J, G, H, all of those things. You can have a more simplified approach. We have more work to do there. But with that simplification also came added service. So, the key to making transit useful, which is really the paradigm, is to have frequent, reliable service that doesn't get bogged down, that makes it easy for users to understand. And then when they have that waiting experience at a shelter, it's going to be comfortable. So this is what this is all designed to do. And it's going to come in these phases where we get the buses going to where they need to go. We're going to expand service into Crystal City very soon from Columbia Pike for a 1-seat ride. So you have that frequency, reliability, you add to it the safety, the comfort, and the convenience. That's when you have premium transit all in a nutshell.
And it's actually not just related, these stations aren't just related to the comprehensive transit plan for the Pike. They're related to our entire plan for the development of Columbia Pike. Because the Pike plan that is, I think, been adopted for about 15 years at this point, envisions a fair amount of new residents coming to the Pike. We want to welcome folks. We know we need to add housing, particularly as we see Crystal City and other places growing. But what Arlington has long tried to do is add residents without adding cars. And so having a system that is desirable, such that folks who might be coming to live in these future apartments being built along Columbia Pike or housing can choose and will choose buses because they're predictable, because they're speedy, because they're comfortable when they're waiting. It's all very much of a piece. And the infrastructure improvements Christian was describing, the kind of in-ground, that's a signal that transit is a fixed and serious part of the corridor. And for an area that we're trying to develop in a way that is just as transit-oriented as our rail corridors, but doesn't have the rail, that fixed infrastructure sends a really important message to the riders and to people who might be interested in building or starting a business on Columbia Pike. That this system of transit-oriented development that Arlington is built on is here to stay.
And a priority.
Indeed.
So, all right. Well, one more sort of transportation topic, the closing of the 23rd Street pedestrian tunnel in Crystal City. Now, I admitted before we were on the air that I don't think I even realized there was a tunnel because I've always crossed at the street level, which I'm guessing many people do, correct?
In fact, most people do, Kara, and that's why we're closing this.
Okay, well, there you go. Okay, topic closed.
But that's it. Most people cross at grade. And so therefore, what you have is an unused tunnel that is primarily used by people who are, not using it for any useful purpose. So we do have a fair amount of graffiti, vandalism. We do have people who are indigent and homeless who may use the facility. There are certainly better, more dignified options for them, and no reason to maintain the cost of cleaning and power washing and having the security hazard underground when most people make the prudent decision to cross at grade because it's simple to see where you want to go. These tunnels are a relic of times past when we designed our roads so that we're just
Moving
wishing cars
through,
in, and so
absolutely.
crossing became impossible. We have worked toward making Crystal City and Richmond Highway very crossable at 23rd Street. There's more that will be done in the coming years to make that experience even more improved. But I can say from my time living in Arlington, when I moved here in the early 1990s, it's improved dramatically.
Yeah.
So that tunnel is really obsolete. It's a nuisance. There is no special need for it, so we're going to get rid of it.
Now, one question I had, that it's a VDOT-owned roadway, correct? So do they need to give a final approval on
Yeah.
whether we close it, or how does
we
that
always
work?
have to get permission.
Yeah.
No, I mean, seriously. Yeah, we do have to get permission, and this, our action was to seek that authorization to
Okay.
get permission, and then ultimately we'll have a cost-sharing agreement. VDOT will contribute a little bit of money towards the demolition of the above-ground structures and then the filling in of the tunnel. We'll be on the hook for the bulk of it, but all told, this is less than a $500,000 project to close this tunnel. And what we'll see in terms of a return is a minimum savings of $25,000 a year on the direct cleaning
Right.
costs, but we're spending more on security
Maintenance.
concerns
Absolutely.
and others.
Which we, frequently been raised by some of the small business owners that are adjacent to the tunnel with the maintenance. The only other thing I'd note too is just to bring this full circle to our Vision Zero conversation or a conversation about the Pike. I think if you travel in big cities internationally, these are often tunnels you end up using because that is your only way to safely cross the street.
Right.
The fact that this has become sort of vestigial and withered away in terms of use, I do think is a sign that we've made the street feel safe and inviting to those who want to cross. So in some ways, I hope that the closure of this tunnel can represent a success story. When you give people a safe path to feel like they can be on the street interacting with others, they'll take it. And I hope we'll continue to do that throughout the county.
All right. Well, that seems like a perfect place to bring us to the end of this month's County Board Wrap-Up. Christian and Katie, thank you both very much for joining us. And thank you for watching. The board's recessed for August, so we're going to see you again after the board's next meeting, which will be in September. Remember, all county board meetings are open to the public and live streamed and archived on our website, arlingtonva.us, and just search County Board. Or you can always tell us what you think about these and other issues at topics.arlingtonva.us/engage. I'm Kara O'Donnell, and we'll see you in September.